Chapter 3, Part 1 of A History of the Christian Church during the First 6 Centuries. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of the Christian Church during the First 6 Centuries by Samuel Cheetham. Chapter 3, Part 1. The Early Struggles of the Church. The first external enemy which nascent Christianity had to encounter was the malice of the Jew. To the Jews were due the deaths of St. Stephen, St. James the Apostle, and St. James the Just. It was by the Jews that St. Paul was evil entreated, almost to the death. Even where they had no political power, their irregular animosity was still active. But the most extensive and cruel of all the persecutions which Christians had to endure at the hands of the Jews was that which befell them when Bar Kokhba raised the standard of insurrection against the Romans. Christians, of course, refused to acknowledge the pretended Son of the Star as Messiah. Their principles forbade them to join in rebellion, hence they had to endure the wrath of those who regarded them as renegades, while the Roman government simply looked upon them as Jews. The rebellion of Bar Kokhba was put down, and a new Roman town, Aelia Capitolina, built on the ruins of Jerusalem by the direction of the Emperor Hadrian. When the Jews could practice no violent persecution, they made amends by the circulation of calumnies. Their schools of learning at Babylon and Tiberias seem to have been centers of this kind of manufacture. But the great internecine struggle was between the Church and the Empire. The Empire was no doubt greatly more tolerant in matters of religion than the small republics of Greece had been. It necessarily sanctioned the worship of the gods of the conquered nations which were included within its borders, but it was not indifferent in matters of religion. The Roman gods were the gods of the state, and the state by no means looked favorably upon forms of worship which tended to diminish the reverence due to them. The old republic was extremely jealous of foreign superstitions, and the principle of the law which forbade the worship of foreign gods not adopted by the state was never allowed to drop wholly out of sight. In a Roman colony we find the complaint brought against the apostles that they taught customs which it was not lawful for Romans to receive or to observe. Pomponia Graecina was accused before a family tribunal of practicing foreign superstition in the days of Nero. Magic was forbidden under severe penalties. The laws of the 12 Tables assigned death as the penalty for practicing incantation, and probably the miracles of healing attributed to the Christians, especially cures of demoniacs, brought upon them the suspicion of magic. The possession of magical books was also a crime, and the sacred books of Christians were often reputed magical. We have the testimony of Tertullian that the principal charges against Christians were those of sacrilege and lèse-majesté, and his words imply that to refuse to worship the gods of the empire was to be guilty of sacrilege. The punishment of sacrilege was in the discretion of the proconsul, who might apportion it according to the circumstances of the case and the age and sex of the criminal. In extreme cases he might sentence offenders to be burnt alive, crucified, or cast to wild beasts. Under the head of lèse-majestas was brought every act and every word which might tend to impair the authority of the government or to bring it into discredit. It is easy to see how wide a range charges of lèse-majesté might have. Probably the rumor that Christians expected existing states soon to pass away and a new kingdom to succeed brought them under the notice of the tribunals. But there was nothing of which the empire was more intolerant than the formation of associations unknown to the law. From the very earliest days of imperial rule, attempts were made to check the formation of clubs and societies, and severe legislation was directed against them. One who held an unlawful meeting was liable to the same pains and penalties as one who seized a public place by armed force, that is, to the penalties of lèse-majesté. Some exceptions were however made. Religious meetings were not forbidden, provided that they were so conducted as not to offend against the laws relating to illicit collegia, and benefit societies consisting of poor people and slaves were permitted in Rome to meet and make their payments to the common fund once a month. A rescript of Septimius Severus extended this provision to all Italy and the provinces. Christian congregations may sometimes have received legal recognition as benefit clubs, for they did undoubtedly contribute at their meetings to a common fund for the purpose of mutual succor, though they could scarcely have complied with the condition of meeting only once a month. But on the whole, the Church was clearly regarded as a secret society of a very dangerous kind, having occult signs and passwords, and bound together in a confederation which extended over the whole empire. That Christians formed unlawful associations is the first charge brought against them by Celsus and Tertullian. A Christian advocate scarcely attempts to refute it. The Roman statesmen saw in the Christian Church either the ephemeral product of fanatical folly and delusion, or a slinking gang of conspirators, a lucifuga natio which the state must needs put down were it only for its own safety. The secrecy of their meetings in time of persecution was a main cause of the calumnies which were circulated against them. The empire was full of mysteries and secret orgies, yet against none do we find such vile accusations brought as those which were reiterated against the Christians. They were atheists. They indulged in Theestian banquets. They revelled in horrible incest. They worshipped a monster with an ass's head. That they should be called atheists was perhaps not altogether unnatural. Those who forsook the temples of the gods and worshipped no deity graven by art and man's device were to the heathen populace of course atheists. Their nightly assemblies for the feast of love and the Holy Communion, and a few mystical words relating to the agape, the commemoration of the death of Christ, and the participation of his flesh and blood, grossly misunderstood, gave rise probably to the horrible charges of murder, strange food, and illicit love. Such rumors as these caused men like Tacitus to regard the Church of Christ, the only society in the empire in which a pure and noble morality was taught, as a loathsome superstition. It was thought to bring down the wrath of the gods on the state. If an earthquake shook a city, or a river overflowed its banks, or the seasons were unpropitious, the cry arose, "To the lions with the Christians!" And it must not be forgotten that all those who lived by pagan worship found their occupation threatened. The makers of silver shrines of the Ephesian Artemis were but specimens of a class found wherever a temple existed. And not only those whose material interests were in danger, but paganism in general found its old mythology, its civic feeling, its frank enjoyment of the life of this world called in question by a sect which preached humility and self-renunciation, offering a distant heaven in return for the pleasures of the present life. Many Christians felt it perilous to the soul to swear the soldier's oath or to undertake municipal offices. True, they were submissive to the lawful authority, but the general suspicion against them was so strong that their professions of allegiance were thought to savour more of policy than of truth. The empire could perhaps scarcely be expected to tolerate in the midst of it such a society. It did, in fact, persecute the rising sect with a very vigorous animosity, yet not steadily or continuously, but according to the views of various emperors or even of provincial governors. What was at first popular hatred of an obscure sect became in less than 3 centuries an organized effort of the pagan power to put down its growing rival. When Suetonius tells us that Claudius expelled from Rome, quote, the Jews who were making constant uproar with one Chrestus as a ringleader, close quote, he probably refers to the fact that the preaching of Christ set the Jews' quarter at Rome in a commotion. So far, however, Christianity appears as a Jewish sect, not subject to direct persecution. It is under Nero that the Christians first appear as suffering torture and death, as a sect everywhere spoken against. When Rome was burnt, and rumor assigned the guilt of the deed to Nero himself, he sought to turn the popular rage from himself to the Christians, already the objects of the most unreasonable suspicions. They were sewed up in hides of wild